my sick parade got too large, a Japanese private, because they wanted, everyone had to work for the Japanese. A Japanese private would come along, a non-medical private, take my sick parade, and as long as the men were fit enough to stand, then they were fit enough to work, and off he would go.
Actually, there was order to finish the railway early, so they had to compel the sick man to work hard.
One of the most difficult sections of the construction was an area called Hintok, better known as Hellfire Pass.
When they were making these big cuttings, which were done largely with hammer and tap, they used a certain number of charges to blow the rock. And one of their games was, occasionally, they would fire a charge without telling anybody. So some people got very badly injured with flying sharp rock. I mean, why? It's, you know, what's the sense of all this?
We went out in the morning with all the tools that had been issued, and after work, when we returned, there had to be a roll call of everybody. All the tools had to be handed in, and if one was short, there were usually a few short, and we had to parade, incidentally, with always, practically every day, the odd one or two dead who died out there. They had to be put down at the end, at the side, in order to prove that the same number had returned as went out in the morning.
Every morning I psyched myself up to survive that day only, because every day was never as good as the last one. It was never good. There was never any hope. Never any hope.
Because of lack of control, most of the people died was because of the sickness, not by the being hit, cruel hit to death or isn't so. But if the people had a good control themselves, they didn't drink water from the river or eat raw fish from. If the people, POW, behaved very well, they didn't catch sickness.
In Kanyu camps, I think every disease imaginable was there, but the worst one with the most lives lost was cholera. And the Japanese themselves were scared, and we had to burn these bodies.
That was, I think, perhaps the low point of my experience up there. I mean, looking back now, I can hardly believe I experienced all this.
多少は変わったけどもね、せいぜい1週間か2週間で私は治りましたね。マラリアとかね、なんだ、ゲリスな、コレラがね、流行った。コレラが流行ったね、対面線では。で、だいぶなくなったですよ。そんでね、そう言っちゃ悪いんだけどもね、日本の兵隊はお互いに助け合ってね、預かった手拭いを濡らして頭冷やすとかやったけどもね、ちょっと変に思ったのが、捕虜になった人たちはね。
私は病気にかかっておりません。でも捕虜たちはですね、かなりの病気にかかられて、元どういったんですかね、衛生兵とかあるいは軍員さんがおりまして。
The medical officers, in my opinion, were absolute angels. They had no drugs to work with, not even an aspirin A colonel in the hospital camp at Chunkai, Colonel Weary Dunlop, an Australian, did fantastic work.
Weary Dunlop, this most wonderful Australian surgeon, a bigger man, a man I can't praise enough. I had something on my forehead, he was going to take it off. There wasn't any anaesthesia for it, but I think it was a melanoma or something he was worried about. And beside us was another table, and there was an Australian who was really almost a skeleton, really kneeling on it with his bum in the air, because Dunlop wanted to use a proctoscope, which was made in the camps, actually. I remember him looking into this man's bottom, you see, and he said, and this lovely Australian voice, and he said, "Oh yes," he said, "I think I've seen you before." I nearly fell off the table. We were rolling about. What a lovely way to greet a friend, you know.
At one camp alone, over 120 legs were amputated in a single year.
Operations, mostly amputations as a result of these jungle ulcers, were done with a saw borrowed from the Japanese, which they said they wanted back cleaned after the operation or operations. They did occasionally produce a bit of sake so that people could be put out to some extent.
I said to him, "I've got this ulcer, what can I do?" He said, "Well, I'm sorry, I have nothing to give you. I don't have any drugs. But if you go down to the latrine, pick up maggots, count them, put them on top of your ulcer, and let the maggots do their work." I said, "And what will they do?" "They'll eat all the rotten flesh." And he says, "With a good chance, you'll get a clean wound."
I'd been badly, they'd kicked my nose in. I had a bad fractured nose and a hole between my eyes. I couldn't see anything anywhere. I was next to an Aussie that had his leg cut off that morning, a big Aussie. And I mean, it was routine stuff when you, under the most crude circumstances. Then we were lying on bamboo. And anyway, in the middle of the hut was another man who was in my own regiment. And he had an ulcer that was granulating quite well. It was in far better condition than hundreds of the others around him. And he was kneeling up and hugging his knees and rocking like so many of the ulcer patients did out of sheer agony and pain. And kept on saying, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die." And this Aussie said, "Look, mate," he said, "you're going to die, hurry up and bloody do it, I want some sleep." He said, and this lovely Australian boy. And we were fawning about it. I mean, I thought it was hilarious. Within 2 hours, he was dead. And I remember this Aussie in the morning saying, "Oh, Christ," he said, "the last thing anybody ever said to him," he said.
The railway was finally completed in October 1943. On schedule, but at the cost of over 120,000 lives.
また犠牲が発生すると、そういうことは考えが浮かばなかったんで、犠牲というよりもそういう犠牲なんてのは考えないで、英軍が5年かかるというやつを日本軍は1年半ぐらいで完成するような作業状態で作業に着手しましたから、犠牲とかなんとかそういうことは考えないで、ただ命令のままに作業に邁進しました。
The POWs and local workers who died building the railway were buried where they fell. One life lost for every sleeper laid.
The jungle was full of British dead. You know, we buried them, a lot of them where they fell.
You know, we left 12,000 dead up there, quite apart from the wreckage that survived, you know.
But it had all been for no purpose. Within months, the war had turned against the Japanese, and the Allies started to regain lost territories.
These converted Hurricanes, now called Hurry bombers, carried two 500-pound bombs tucked beneath the wing. Down there, somewhere in that tangled wilderness, lies their target, or rather, that's where their target lay. After this heavy pounding, there'll not be much hospitality left in it for the Japanese invader.
やっぱりあれですね、対面鉄道というよりもインパール作戦のね、ところはたまに思い出し夢にも見ます。ですから今戦友に隣の部屋にありますけど、戦友の霊をね。
それも勝てるあれではなかったけども、当時は勝つか負けるかっていうよりも自分で食べることがね、そう自分の欲望でね、どこ行ってあそこの村が行ったら食べ物があるとかね、あとは水飲むよとかね、そういうようなことで負けるとか勝つかってまでは考えなかったな。
敗戦の国ですからね、逃げてきた時にですね、もう二の駅もあそこに大体本部があったんですよ。私は駅長所だったところに。それもおいお前らも一緒に帰ろういうことでどんどん南下していって、いわゆる私は特別の列車持っておりますもんだから。
I think some of the officers, I think Weary Dunlop had some intimation from somewhere that things were getting pretty sticky. We had a huge camp with a huge pit around it and a big bund on one side, and they'd put a machine gun into the wall at one end, which really told us quite a lot about what they were intending to do anyway, but still we didn't know. And then, of course, within about 9 or 10 days, they had Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that finished it. It was just saved by the bell, really.
そして原爆を落とされたっていう時にってただ、原子爆弾が落ちたんだっていうようなことをうつうつ聞いたけど、それでも負けると思わなかった。
The Japanese had ceased to fight, you know, from that time onwards. Well, we knew then we were officially free.
Japan surrendered to the Allied forces on the 2nd of September 1945. The POWs were at last free men.
The Allies had retaken Singapore, and a couple of days after that they were beginning to march the Japanese, by then prisoners. And one of our divisional people, soldiers, was, you know, like people do, sort of just watching what was going on. And at one point he turned to his pal and said, "Look at those poor buggers, now it's their turn." And that to me sums up the attitude of the ordinary soldier.
We had a sergeant major, a British sergeant major, that was in our camp. Like, we didn't have any officers with us. And what he said was, he gave us a bit of good advice. He said, now, he advised us not to take any action against the Japanese. He said, you've survived 3.5 years of being prisoners. So he said, now, think of your families, don't do anything stupid that might get you killed, like, you know.
しかも内地へ帰るときバンコクで白いカードを渡されれば内地へ帰る。ブラックカードって黒いカードを渡されるとノーでこう検問所に行って声明を言いますとミスター吉野言うと OK って言えばこっち行き白い管をでノーって言ったらもうすぐに手錠をはめられてチャンキーの刑務所へ送られたんですけどで